Beware the mouse. The mouse devours all. So I'm going to talk about something that I have been avoiding talking about up to this point. Now, the news that Disney and Fox had entered some degree of negotiations for Disney to purchase portions of Fox's business, that news broke a couple of weeks ago, but I've avoided talking about it pretty much for the same reason that I really rarely talk about when an actor or director is only in talks to be involved in a movie project that otherwise would be something I'd talk about, because I don't like to waste the time, the effort, or the brain power, dedicated to going over all this stuff that is only in talks, that maybe that'll happen. I like when things are set, like this is what we actually plan to do. That's when I like to talk about it. Now, as of the recording of this, a deal has not been officially formally finalized, but the report is that a deal was struck. They just haven't announced it yet, and we have a pretty good image of what that deal looks like. So before I start getting into this, what it means for various aspects of things, or what I think it could mean, different ways things could go, I do want to point out before anybody starts going out, and despite my little intro bit, all the people who are terrified that Disney wants to control everything, please keep in mind that this was not a situation of Disney approached Fox going, "We want to consume you." Fox very clearly wanted to unload a number of things. This was a motivated seller situation because Disney wasn't even the only ones they were talking to. They were talking to Comcast, they were talking to Verizon. It's just Disney's the one that actually went the distance on it. So what Fox has basically unloaded and what Disney has purchased appears to be the 21st Century Fox film and television production studios and all of the creative assets that's involved in that. And there's a few other things involved in the deal: the A&E network, Star TV, Nat Geo, and a couple of smaller things like that. It does not look like the Fox network is part of the deal. I actually think it can't be, because I don't think that Disney is allowed to own more than one broadcast network, because they already own ABC. So that kind of leaves up in the air what happens to the Fox network. I figure one of two things happens. Either they try and sell that off to somebody else, or they just let it die. I think that might be the more likely situation, because since Fox and since Disney is acquiring all of the production elements and all of the and the rights and control of all of the stuff that Fox had, the network itself kind of becomes not worth very much. You basically literally just get the right to broadcast on this channel, but you get none of the stuff that was already existing on it. And in case folks are wondering, the reason Fox is doing all this and unloading all this stuff is they have made a decision as a company that they can't compete with the giants of scripted entertainment, basically. And they see that right now as Disney, Amazon, Netflix. They've decided that they can't win that game, so they're going to get out of that game. And instead, as a company, they're going to focus pretty much exclusively on news and sports and things like that, which they feel they've got a much better foot in and a leg up on. So what does Disney now actually take control of? Quite a bit, actually. There's the stuff that I'm going to spend the majority of this video talking about. Let's put that off for a second and talk about some of the other stuff. Just real quick, just to touch on it. Just to give you an idea of everything that Disney has now acquired. Because it is going to be all of the stuff that Fox had the rights to. So that means The Simpsons, Family Guy, Bob's Burgers, the Alien franchise, the Predator franchise, the Planet of the Apes franchise, and a ton of other stuff. It's a lot of stuff, and there's going to be a lot of options for what they will or won't do with it. Now, obviously, the main sort of goal for them in acquiring this stuff was undoubtedly the X-Men and Fantastic Four franchises, and as I said, I'm going to get to those a little bit later. They're going to take up the bulk of this video anyway. But just to touch on the other stuff, because Fox does have a number of fairly substantial adult-oriented material. I'm not sure whether or not you could say that Simpsons is necessarily adults. It's more upper teens, but Family Guy's pretty adult. Alien, Predator, those are traditionally R-rated franchises. And I'm sure there are some people out there who are going, Disney's gonna turn them into PG-13. People forget Disney does release R-rated movies, just not under the Disney banner. They do it through Touchstone, or they have means to release more adult stuff. Like, the Marvel Netflix stuff is, if that material had been released in film, it all would have been rated R. So, don't automatically assume just because Disney now controls something that it's going to be made PG-13 or PG. It's a question of where it fits into things overall. And a lot of these properties are too valuable for them to just sit on. Again, I have no doubt a lot of the things I just listed are secondary to the main thing Disney is after, so we might not hear about new plans on them for a little while, but they're not just going to vanish into the ether. That's not going to happen, because then you're leaving money on the table that way. So that brings us to really the main thing that you would expect a channel called Council of Geeks to talk about, which is the Marvel properties that will now be reclaimed under the Marvel banner. So Fantastic Four, there isn't really too much to talk about. There was nothing being done with either a follow-up to Fan4stick or another reboot, so Marvel can just do whatever they want with it. X-Men, however, is a bit of a different beast, because that was still an ongoing concern. So the question is, what happens now? What happens to the films and the projects that were already more or less done but haven't been released yet? What happens to the ones that were being worked on? What happens after all of that as far as X-Men goes? And I have a number of thoughts about all this, so I'm kind of gonna run through things a bit. So for X-Men, there are 3 films, X-Men related, that are scheduled to come out next year that are basically already shot and are in some degree of post-production, meaning that they've still got effects to do, music, all that stuff. But the first one that's up is New Mutants, and that's scheduled for an April release. I don't see that changing. I figure that still comes out as planned, because I anticipate it's probably going to be pretty standalone in and of itself, so it can be a complete story, and then they can decide whether or not it's something they want to follow up on later. Deadpool's going to be an odd one. Deadpool 2 will still get released. There's no question about that, because it is a massively popular film, and the movie's more or less done. At the very least, it's already shot at this point, and it would just look bad. It would be a bad waste of fan goodwill. They'd lose a lot of it if they just didn't release that, because it's not family friendly. But that thing I said before about the fact that Disney and even Marvel are not adverse to dealing in more R-rated material, I think Deadpool is in a little bit of an awkward place, because Deadpool is very much an R-rated property. But the problem is, if Disney gets a hold of him, that means potentially he ends up tying directly into their PG-13 family-friendly line of properties. And there's a possibility Disney might get antsy about that and be a little bit uncomfortable with it. So I figure there's a couple of possible outcomes. There's the possibility that Ryan Reynolds and the other sort of creatives behind the Deadpool franchise just aren't able to see eye to eye to Disney. They walk away, and then for my money, Disney puts Deadpool on ice, because I'd like to think they have enough understanding to realize, as popular as the character is, it is Ryan Reynolds as that character that is really the push right now. And so recasting and going in a new direction would be a very bad idea. Assuming that isn't the case, because I don't think they would do this, but if Disney said, okay, we'll keep Deadpool, but he's got to be PG-13 now, I think Ryan Reynolds and the rest of them would walk. They spent so much energy trying to ensure it was R-rated in the first place. They're not going to stick around if it's bumped down to PG-13. So the question then becomes, what do they do with him? And I don't think they would just want to put him on ice, because, like I said, he's really popular, he's really valuable right now as an intellectual property. But like I said, I suspect Disney would get very uncomfortable with him having immediate direct ties to the Marvel universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And before people tell me, well, the Netflix shows have a tie into it. Yeah, but first of all, it's through a different delivery method. So there's an immediate sort of bit of a wall there. And they haven't had really direct crossovers. They all technically happen in the same universe, but it's been a couple of vague mentions. It doesn't even have the level of crossover that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. has. So I don't think that's comparable. So if they allow Deadpool to continue as a franchise, for my money, they do not allow for crossover between anything that appears in the Deadpool franchise and however they plan to use X-Men and the rest of the MCU, because you know that's going to happen, and I'll talk more about that later. So what I mean by that is, say Deadpool 3 happens after this deal closes, and and Marvel, Disney, now has control of Deadpool. If Deadpool 3 happens, Colossus won't appear in it. He'll be moved over to X-Men, but characters like Cable, Domino, Copycat, Negasonic Teenage Warhead, they will remain in Deadpool only, and they won't cross over to the MCU. They'll probably let Deadpool have his little meta references, because he's a fourth wall breaking character, but they won't make explicit connections between their ongoing MCU franchise and Deadpool. They're gonna basically put him in the side so that he's not directly tying in. For my money, that's what they end up doing. The next movie next year that is supposed to be released is X-Men Dark Phoenix. Now, this one is the only one of the three. I think there's a possibility. I don't think it's likely, but there's a possibility that it may not actually get released. And I think there's a couple of things at play to determine what that is. So I'm going to try and set aside my own certainty at the fact that this thing's going to suck. But even setting that aside as best as I can, I figure there's a couple of issues that Marvel has regarding this movie, because obviously I doubt they'd already know now how they're going to integrate X-Men into the MCU, but those plans are going to be starting to put into place. And by the time X-Men Dark Phoenix comes out, which isn't until November, they're going to know what those plans are. And if the movie doesn't jibe with those plans or doesn't feel like it allows them to really do what they want to do, that might be a reason to scrub it. And what I mean by that is there's no chance that the X-Men universe, as we have known it for the past 17 years, is going to be integrated into the MCU. X-Men characters absolutely will be, but they're not going to try and take that world that we know with that cast and those characters and move it over. That's not going to happen. So they may decide by then, and like I said, Deadpool will probably exist in his own pocket. New Mutants probably could. This one's going to be dealing explicitly with the characters that Marvel itself is going to want to use, and they may just go, you know what? We want to be able to get to our thing now. I think the best shot Dark Phoenix has is if it has either already been made to be or could be retrofitted to be a final chapter for that X-Men franchise. And when I say retrofitted to be, I mean it doesn't come out until November. There's enough time to do reshoots, to make adjustments. And I don't mean drastically change the ending so everybody dies. I mean just bring it to a conclusion. Make sure it doesn't end with a clear setup for a sequel. Have it end on a note that very much feels like we have finished this story. This is all done. And if they can do that, maybe it comes out. Another possibility why they might not release it, though, and this is bringing my bias into the thing, which is that if they get a look at the cut as it currently exists and decide that it just looks bad, they might kill it, because regardless of how much money has already been spent on the thing, and traditional logic says you have a finished product, why not just release it and make whatever you can off it? It could be damaging to the X-Men brand. And Disney has done something like this before. A lot of people may not remember this, but right before Disney bought Lucasfilm and Star Wars, there was a completed animated series called Star Wars Detours, done by a number of people who had worked on Robot Chicken. And it was a series of, very goofy comedic sketches working with Star Wars characters and all of that. And once Disney got a hold of the Star Wars property, they killed that dead. And it was done. The entire thing was done, but they made the determination that that approach of mocking Star Wars was damaging to the brand for what they wanted to do in terms of reviving it as an ongoing film franchise again. If they see X-Men Dark Phoenix and believe it's going to be damaging to the brand, how in the form that it currently exists, and it's not worth the cost to try and fix it, they might actually just scrub it. Again, I don't necessarily think that's likely, but it is a possibility, and I want to say it's a possibility just in case it turns out that I called it. Now, there's a few other X-Men related things that are in much earlier states of development. Supposedly, the Gambit movie was finally getting somewhere. For my money, that probably ends up never happening. I suppose it depends on whether they were locked down on the script or if they're still in the scripting phase. If they're still in the scripting phase on Gambit, it's possible that they could get in there and make the adjustments to the script to have it fit whatever plan they come up with to bring these characters into the MCU. So maybe Gambit still happens, but it's way less likely now than it ever was, and it was kind of a 50-50 shot at best in the first place. So the question then becomes, what about after the stuff that was already planned under Fox? What does Marvel do with the X-Men? And yes, I have talked about this before, how I didn't want Marvel to get control of the X-Men back, but my thoughts in that video, which I stand by, don't matter at this point because they are getting it back. So I need to just set all that aside. If you're wondering why I thought that was a bad idea, check out that video. I'll put a link below for that. But, you know, this is happening, so let's try and figure out a way that they could do it. So I think in a way, this is actually really good for Disney and for Marvel in terms of the MCU, because it's gonna give them some real premier stuff to work with after the end of Infinity War. And obviously they've got some things already lined up after Infinity War. You know, Captain Marvel happens after that. The third Guardians movie happens after that. But the thing to remember is, unlike the comic book characters on the page, actors age. And at this point, you know, maybe they'll stick around for a while longer, but eventually our first wave of heroes, meaning Robert Downey Jr., Chris Hemsworth, Chris Evans, Scarlett Johansson, all these folks are eventually going to stop doing this, either because they decide they really want to focus on other things, or that they just have aged out of it, or what have you. For any number of reasons, these actors will eventually stop playing these parts. And so they have to have new characters to push forward and have get in there. Now, they've already done some legwork in terms of that. We're gonna have Black Panther, as I mentioned, Captain Marvel. If that does really well, I'm dead certain we're gonna get a Ms. Marvel a little bit later on if Captain Marvel does well enough. So I have no doubt they have plans in place, but that's very much a case of them having to build up. I don't want to undermine these characters. A lot of these are great characters, but lesser known, kind of second tier level Marvel characters, and try and premiere them as a big deal and convince audiences that they are a big deal. But you know what would do a lot of that work for them? If they could just introduce Wolverine. I mean, like right off the bat, that saves them so much trouble. And there's all these characters across the X-Men that just being able to bring them in becomes a celebration in and of itself, and it immediately sort of re-energizes things. And it gives them a clear path of where they can take things that was different from what the MCU was doing prior to Infinity War. So it actually opens up a lot of possibilities in many ways. The question then becomes, how do you actually integrate them into this? Because I think the worst thing that you could do would be to imply that mutants are a new thing and like they just started happening, because that, unfortunately, that idea undermines greatly a lot of the allegory and a lot of the metaphor that is at the heart of X-Men. It's important that they've been around for a while. It's important that people are uncomfortable with them and have been. It's important that people were born this way and that it is genetic, and you know there has been a generation of mutants that has already had children who are mutants. You know, this has to have been around for a while. So I think doing a thing where it's like mutation is suddenly starting to happen all over the world, that doesn't work, and especially doesn't work because that really only allows you to have a crap ton of teenagers. That doesn't allow for Professor X of any reasonable age. It doesn't allow for Magneto to be his contemporary. It doesn't allow for Wolverine to be God knows how old. So forget that. That doesn't work. What might work, and this is me spitballing an idea that I basically came up with today. So, give me a little leeway here. But what might work is if you introduce that Professor X and his school well, first of all, you make mutation probably a more rare occurrence than it was in Fox's X-Men movies. So you have Professor Charles Xavier, and his school for the gifted is not just about finding mutants to raise them with a certain philosophy and help them get a handle on their powers. It's also just about hiding them and keeping them out of the public eye. And I could even see like Charles Xavier knowing Nick Fury, and Nick Fury being like, look, I know that this is going on, but if you can keep these people contained, and train them how to use their power, you don't make waves, I'll keep everybody off your back. I could see that kind of relationship working. Now, doing that would necessitate a little bit of a shift in how Professor X is traditionally depicted, because usually Professor X's dream is all about human and mutant harmony. Everybody lives together and everybody is happy with each other and they all dance around the campfire and sing Kumbaya. And I understand that that is sort of the core of the character from the comics. The thing is, though, we already got a really super comic accurate version in the form of Patrick Stewart in the previous franchise. And I think since we already had that, trying to stay as true to the comics version as he already was, you're just gonna go, I wish we still had Patrick Stewart. So I think it makes sense to go a slightly different direction and maybe have him be a little more cynical. Maybe have him hope that one day, and wishful that there could be, some kind of integration between humans and mutants, but maybe he's a little bit more of a pragmatist, and maybe he's more focused on just keeping mutants safe. And you could still have that contrast between him and Magneto, where Magneto says, we shouldn't be hiding, we should be superior. So, you can still have that conflict, even if Charles is trying to keep mutants as a whole hidden and protected. And I think that would be more of a way to do it in terms of seeding the idea that they have been here for a while, but also explaining why we haven't seen them over the course of about a decade worth of these movies already. But as I said, anybody who's being like, Hugh Jackman's gonna be in a movie with Captain America. No, he's not. He's done with this part. Logan was very much him ending his tenure in this role. They're going to introduce the X-Men. They're definitely going to introduce Wolverine, but it's going to be another actor, and it's probably going to be a decidedly different take, because honestly, it should be, because otherwise you end up with a Hugh Jackman imitator. Nobody wants that. Although, actually, I mentioned Wolverine several times. For my money, they hold off introducing him until they get some other X-Men in there. I bet you they put the focus more on some of the characters that were always kind of there, but really never felt like they had their proper spotlight. Like perhaps Cyclops, maybe Storm, maybe use Kitty Pryde, folks that have been seen in the other movies, but were never the main ones front and center, because, those are the ones that audiences are going to be the most sort of wistful for the version that we had for a long time. So I think the character, you do have to have Charles Xavier. You kind of have to. There's no way around that. So they better cast real smart with that. But I think Wolverine, you got to put to the background. If they allow Dark Phoenix to come out as a movie, they'll probably want to put Jean Grey in the background. Beast maybe put in the background. Magneto, maybe hold off on him for a little bit. And Mystique as well. Unfortunately, she's now been overexposed. So I think their best bet will be to not like never do, but for the introduction of the X-Men, to try and start out with familiar faces, but not the ones that have been the primary face of the X-Men franchise when it was under Fox, so that they can get their footing under them and then introduce the Disney version of the better known characters like Wolverine, Magneto, Jean Grey, Mystique, etc. So those are my general thoughts. As much as I railed against the idea of Disney reclaiming X-Men as a franchise before, at this point, I've accepted that it's going to happen. In my ideal world, it wouldn't be happening, but it is going to happen, and there are a lot of good potential things to come out of it. You know what? I haven't mentioned yet, there's the TV end of things. So there's a couple of X-Men shows on right now. There's Gifted, which has not been confirmed to get a second season yet anyway. So For my money, that probably just doesn't get renewed and they have it just be the one season. Maybe it gets a second season, but from my understanding, because I still haven't seen Gifted, from my understanding, it has more explicit, clear connections to the X-Men universe as Fox was doing it than something like Legion, which I'll talk about in a second. So because of that would be one more reason for Disney just to leave it at one season and not give it anything more after that, which from what I hear, I've heard generally positive things, that might end up being a shame. Legion it may have already shot, or it's in the process of shooting its second season right now. They'll probably let that happen because Legion is very much, it has like one Easter eggy connection to the X-Men franchise as a whole, but is largely its own bizarre little thing. So they'll probably let season 2 happen. After that, I don't know, because an odd thing that I couldn't find, FX did not appear to be part of what Disney was buying. Like I mentioned, some of the other channels they were getting, A&E, Nat Geo, whatever, but FX wasn't among them. And that strikes me as odd. And that it is also slightly concerning to me because I want to know what's going to happen to that network and the shows that are on it, because FX has some of the best TV going right now. It's got Legion, it's got Fargo, it's got American Horror Story, American Crime Story. It's, well, not FXX now, but it's the home of Archer. There's wonderful but decidedly adult aimed material on FX, and so far as I can tell, it was not part of the deal that that Disney was taking over that network. So I don't know what happens after that. I suppose the question is how many of those shows were in-house productions or were being produced by basically other entities and were simply airing on FX. I wasn't prepared to do that level of research to find out, but I really hope that the shows that I just listed don't end up canceled or homeless or what have you. So I think that's about it. I have no idea how long this is going to be. I have rambled on a long time. I'm not looking forward to editing this, but Disney buying a whole bunch of Fox stuff. What are your thoughts on it? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Don't forget to like, subscribe. Check me out on Twitter at Council of Geeks. Give a listen to the Council of Geeks podcast that's available on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher Radio. I'm also one half of the Punch Like a Girl podcast. That is a presentation of the Fire and Water Podcast Network. fireandwaterpodcast.com. Links for all this stuff is down below. And until next time, this council is adjourned.